Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Loseniziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. We continue the series of presenting games suggested to us by my Facebook friends. And in this video, we'll show the second game suggested by the 2024 European champion, my Facebook friend, Alexander Indjic. And this time he's facing Blazo Kalezic from Montenegro. The game took place at my own country, Greece, in the island of Crete, at a place called Chers. The year was 2017 and it was a part of the European Team Championship. When the game took place, Blazo Kalezic, his opponent, had a rating of 24.65 versus 25.91 for Alexander Indjic, making Alexander the favorite. And by now, 8 years later, Blazo Kalezic rating has decreased a little bit from 24.65 to 23.95. He is currently an international master, while Alexander Indjic has increased a little bit from 25.91 to 16.35, and he's a grandmaster. And we're going now to move to the chessboard of chess.com. We're going to share the screen. And once again, we're going to go through the moves. I'm going to enter them manually as I copy them from the score sheet. Blazo has the white pieces, while my Facebook friend Alexander has the black pieces. And the computer is going to tell us, the computer, by the way, is Stockfish 16, who is standing better. Positive number means white is standing better, negative means that black is standing better. They'll tell us by how much, with one meaning the difference of one pawn. Computer will tell us if a move happens to be book move, brilliant, excellent, good move, the best move in the position, if it happens to be an inaccuracy or a mistake or a blunder. And we'll also suggest the top 5 moves for the other player whose turn is to come. And we're starting the game, as I mentioned, Blazo Kalezic from Montenegro has the white pieces, Alexander Indjic from Serbia has the black pieces. And just to tell you in advance, the first 11 moves are all of them book moves. So we'll go quickly through them. We're starting with the Sicilian defense, that means pawn to e4 and pawn to c5. And then we'll go to one of its variations that is called the Najdorf variation. This is the position after 5 moves. This is called the Najdorf variation. Both players completed the first 5 moves, all of them book moves. And the computer believes that white is standing a little bit better by 0.59, just because white started first. But so long as the players follow book moves, this does not mean too much. And the 6th move for white is what's called the burn or the English attack. Bishop goes to e3. You see here, Sicilian defense, open, Najdorf, and the English attack. We continue with book moves, although I don't think they have any further names. Pawn e5 attacks the knight to d4, knight goes back to b3, bishop to e6 for Alexander, queen to d2 for Blazo, and knight to d7 for Alexander, develops a knight. Both sides develop their knights, try to control the center, standard things. Now, Blazo is going to move the pawn to f3. Why? Because the pawn on e4 was attacked by the knight on f6, defended by the knight on c3, but if the knight cannot leave c3 until now, because then the e4 pawn is lost. And what if it had to leave because of an attack? Let's assume the pawn goes b5 and b4. That is why extra protection from the pawn on f3 was needed. But this opens the diagonal from h4 to e1, and white better keep this in mind. Pawn to h5 for Alexander, that wants to start attacking along the king side. Knight to d5. Now, yes, now Blazo can move his knight to d5, which before he couldn't, otherwise he would lose the e4 pawn. and bishop takes on d5. You don't want your opponent's knight to stand in your half of the board, especially since it is going to be an outpost, meaning that there's no c pawn to attack it. The e pawn has already made it to e5, so knight on d5 would be an outpost, and that is why Alexander decided to take it with his bishop. We completed the first 10 moves. White advantage is 0.29. This doesn't mean too much yet, just because white started first. And let's continue. Of course, Blazo needs to take it back. And Alexander starts preparing the fianchetto, moving the pawn to g6. But Blazo is not going to let him fianchetto, not yet at least, because he moves his knight on e5, attacking the pawn on b7. If Alexander would directly fianchetto now, the knight would go to b7 and threaten the queen on d8 and the pawn on d6. And Alexander protects the b7 pawn by moving the queen to c7. Pawn to c4 for Alexander, that gains more space and gives extra protection to the d5 pawn. And by the way, the c4 pawn is protected both by the knight on a5 and the bishop on f1. So Alexander cannot win it by pushing the pawn to b6, and then when the knight from a5 will have to move. Still, the c4 pawn is protected. Bishop to g7, and now Alexander completes the fianchetto king. His bishop controls the long diagonal from a1 to h8. Bishop to e2 for Blazo, that develops his bishop and is ready to castle kingside. Pawn to e4 for Alexander, that wants to gain more space and attack along the e file. Blazo castles kingside. He'd rather not take the pawn on e4 first. Let's see what would happen if he took it. Because then the knight would take the e4, attack the queen on d2, and also the bishop from g7 will exert pressure on the pawn on b2 and the rook on a1. But now Alexander will take the pawn on f3, and we completed the first 15 moves. And white, Blazo Kalezic has an advantage of 0.42. Let's see how game continues. Blazo takes the f3 pawn with his own g2 pawn. Kingside castling for Alexander as well. Both sides have castled kingside, but both sides have an issue with their kings. Alexander's issue is that the h7 pawn has moved to h5, and Blazo's issue is even greater. There's no g pawn in front of the king, and so Blazo better be careful in case of an attack along the g file. Pawn to b4 for Blazo, that doesn't need to keep his queen along the e1 before diagonal to protect the knight. The knight's attacked by the queen, by the way. Knight to e5 for Alexander, that brings also the knight near the white king. The white king on g1, since it has no g pawn and the f pawn has already moved to f3, is not completely safe, and black wants to bring as many pieces as possible to exploit it, because otherwise you may have a wonderful advantage but no way to exploit. Rook to c1 for Blazo, that wants to have his rook facing the black queen. But Alexander is not going to let him enjoy this fact for too long. Queen goes to d7. King to g2 for Blazo, that feels his king is a little bit exposed, and maybe if it went near the pawns, it would be safer. In addition, he doesn't have to worry about the knight from e5 going to f3 with a check. Now it cannot be done because the knight would be lost, but perhaps in the future it could. Rook to e8 for Alexander, that wants to start controlling more of the e file, and if possible, double his rooks along the e file, and have strong attack versus the two white bishops. Rook to f2 for Blazo, and rook to e7 for Alexander, that is preparing to double his rooks along the e file. The computer doesn't like it, would prefer to start an attack with the b pawn going to b5, and consider that a mistake. We completed the first 20 moves, and white Blazo Kalezic has an advantage of 0.42. This is not that significant yet. Let's see how game will continue. Blazo pushes his pawn to h3. Rook to e8 for Alexander, that finally doubles his rook, which means that if the e5 knight would disappear, then Alexander could win the bishop on e3. But Blazo is not going to let that happen. Bishop already moves to g5 and attacks the knight on f6. Yes, the knight is defended by the bishop on f6, so we're not talking about the lost position. And let's see now how Alexander is going to continue. And Alexander does a move that is a little bit unexpected. Knight from e5 will go to g4. And computer is going to tell us it's a brilliant move. Why? First of all, the knight can be taken either by the f or by the h pawn. What does Alexander gain in exchange? Yes, he pressures the bishop on e2, but he attacks it twice and it's defended twice. So materially, it doesn't seem that. And by the way, when Alexander played his move, he didn't even win a pawn. Let's see this again. Usually when you do the sacrifices, you gain a pawn near the enemy king, and so you say it's worth to lose a piece, but I'm depriving my enemy king of pawn protection. But now that does not even happen. So the risk is taking is significant, but let's see if this is justified. Yes, the computer will give 0.59 advantage for black, but we need to see it on the chessboard. Let's see how the game will continue. First of all, we exchange along the g4 square. We exchange on f6. Blazo bishops take the black knight. Alexander's bishop takes back. So you see that materially white has +2, a knight for a pawn. But the computer gives a 0.90 advantage for Alexander. These things are not easy to see at all. How can one side that is so much behind materially is overall ahead? And Palazzo will move his rook to h1 to occupy the open h file. That is an important advantage, especially since this file is going to lead towards the black king on g8. Rook to e3 for Alexander. And after 25 moves, Alexander Indjic has an advantage of 0.53. Let's continue now. Well, it's nice to have these advantages, but the game has not yet been decided. And we continue now with the 26th move of white. And here we are. Bishop goes to d1. Computer thinks that this is a miss. White had better take the pawn on g4. And now, yes, now Alexander Indjic really has an important advantage of 2.32. And Alexander will continue by taking the pawn on f3 with a check. In accuracy, the computer would rather have the bishop from f6 go to c3 and threaten both the queen on d2 and the pawn on b4. Bishop takes back the pawn. Queen goes to f5 for Alexander, that is threatening the bishop on f3. It is threatened twice by the rook e3 and the queen on f5, defended twice by the rook on f2 and the king on g2. Rook on h3 for Alexander, that is defending it a third time. And rook goes to e4 for Alexander. The rook could be lost from the white bishop, but is it worthwhile? The computer says it is the best move without explaining why. Let's try to see why. What would happen if the bishop would take, in fact, not even one of the top moves you see here for black? What would happen if the bishop would take it? Yes, the queen would go to h3 with a check, protected by the rook, and then the king could only go to g1, and the rook would check from g3. It's not made yet, but first of all, black was not going to lose any more material because it's a rook exchange, but the white king would be in an even worse situation. That is why Blazo is not going to take the rook. Instead, he's going to take a pawn on b7. And you may be thinking this is the other end of the board. Why take the pawn there when the king is in danger? And the reason, you will see it little by little, is because white will start counterplay along the queen side and will try to promote pawns. But let's see how this is going to work. Bishop goes to e5 for Alexander. He wants to control most squares near the white king. The bishop now controls or exerts pressure both on the squares g3 and h2. Pawn to c5. That now without the b7 pawn, white has not yet created a pass pawn, but is near creating one. If there is exchange along the c5, then the b4 square, the b4 pawn that will go to c5 will be a passed pawn and very near promotion. That is why Alexander is not going to start exchanging the pawns. Instead, he's going to check from g5. And we completed the first 30 moves, and now, according to the computer, black has a significant advantage, 5.13. This is very important. Even though materially, look at that, materially, white is ahead by +3. So we have, at this point, 30 moves have been completed. White has 3 extra pawns materially, and while black is ahead by 5.13. So Alexander completes the 30 moves very successfully. Advantage of 5.13, which means unless you blunder it or you make a series of mistakes, it could give you great chances to win. But let's see how game will continue. You see that the rook cannot go to g3 to block it because then the queen will take it supported by the bishop. And you don't want your king to be at the edge of the board. That's why king goes to f1. Bishop to c3 for Alexander, that attacks both the queen on d2 and the pawn on b4. And Blas is not sure what to do. Where to save the queen? The queen can only save that the squares c1, d1, but temporarily, because rook goes to e1 check, queen has to take it, and then rook will take the queen. That is why, believe it or not, the white queen is lost. So Blazo will try to take the most he can for the queen. His queen basically becomes a desperado. And she's going to lose his queen either way, or rather, at least let's take the rook on e4. Queen is lost. Rook goes to e3. Bishop takes on e3. And rook, that is attack, goes to f3. And after this series of exchanges, you see that now white has a material advantage of plus, I'm sorry, white had before, now black has a material advantage of +1. But believe it or not, now that I had material, his overall advantage has decreased a little bit from more than 5 to 4.57. And now the pawns are exchanged on c5. Sorry, this was a mistake. We have to delete this move. Yes. Now the pawn on d5 is becoming a passed pawn for Plazo for white. He's not going to take the pawn on c5, I'm sorry, before, because then perhaps it would be lost by the bishop, even though the knight will take the bishop. But what Plazo wants to do, he sees he's overall behind. He doesn't have, of course, the complete evaluation, but he wants to push the passed pawn as quickly as possible. Sends it to d6, because if the pawn can be promoted, then clearly Plazo will be winning the game. And the computer doesn't like it. It's inaccuracy. Would rather have the knight take the pawn. But this is the opportunity that Alexander wants and takes a pawn on b4, and thus Blazo has a passed pawn, but is not protected and is not connected. And we completed the first 35 moves. The advantage of Alexander is 5.46. It's an important one. If he can keep it, and especially if he doesn't somehow blunder the queen or create some other big mistakes or allow the d6 pawn to get promoted, he has very good chances to win the game. Let's see how the game will continue. Pawn to d7. The passed pawns must be pushed, says chess theory. But give yes, the queen on g5 controls the promotion square, but then the queen will be lost. So if Blazo could play a second move in a row, perhaps would promote the pawn, queen takes it, knight takes it, and then clearly under these conditions, uh, it's going to be, the chances will be Blazos with white to win the game. That is why Alexander is going to stop it by placing his bishop on b6. Rook to d3 for Blazo to support the pawn. So if it gets promoted, what would happen? If Blazo could play a second move and promote it, bishop takes pawn, rook takes, excuse me, bishop, let's start again. If Blazo had a second move to play, pawn is promoted on d8, bishop takes it, rook takes bishop, and then, well, queen would not take rook for knight, but then white would have rook, bishop, and knight for the black queen. Still, white has 3 extra pawns, and 2 of them are connected pass pawns, f7, g6. But I believe still black would be in a better shape, but not so sure of his win. Let's see how Alexander is going to do. Will he try to stop the pawn? Well, he checks with the queen to c1. This clearly postpones the decision. King to e2. Queen to c2 check. King to e1. Maybe a draw, maybe go for repetition, but nope. Alexander will check from c1, and after king goes to e2, he's going to win the pawn on a2, and you may be wondering, you have a pawn at d7, 1 square for promotion. Why should you care about a pawn that has not even started, the a2 pawn? Let's see what's going to happen. We completed the first 40 moves, and Alexander has an advantage of 5.75. Of course, this is assuming that both players play their best. All you need is one big mistake from Alexander, and the game could turn the other way around. Now, He took with a check, so at least the pawn is not going to be promoted. The king would go to d1. And now, instead of stopping the pawn, Alexander decides to start pushing his own pawn. Now that the a2 pawn is not there any longer, this means that the pawn that was on b4 and now it's at b3 is a passed pawn. So both sides have a passed pawn, but the advantage of white is that his pawn is one square near promotion, while black's is two. But on the other side, white controls the d8 square, even though only with his knight, while black does not control the b1 square. Next move. Rook goes to d6 for Blazo, hoping to win the bishop at b6, and then when the pawn is promoted on d8, it cannot be captured. And Alexander ignores it, pushes his pawn on b2. But after the rook made it to d6, the problem is that the b1 square that before was free now is controlled by the bishop on e4. So black cannot just get a second win by pushing the pawn on b1. It will be captured by the white bishop. Yes, black is going to win the white bishop, but we'll have to think about the other pawn being promoted. So now Plazo decides to win the bishop on b6, and by doing so controls the b1 square twice, both by the rook on b6 and the bishop on e4. So how is Alexander going to react? First of all, let's check from a4. King to d2. And now this was a fork, a double attack. Let's go to the previous move. You see it attacked both the king on d1 and the pawn on d7. So that is how Alexander is able to win the pawn from d7, just one square before it would promote, and we promote it without being captured. Computer thinks that this is a great move. Let's see if the queen a4 was a great move as well. Yes, that was also a great move. This is a great move because it prepares this capture. In fact, I would even think that to make the second move a great move as well is a little redundant, because what was important was to see the check and the fork and then win the pawn. And Blazo will cover the check with his bishop, exerting pressure on the a6, even though currently the bishop is pinned. Queen goes to d4 for Alexander. He wants to protect his b2 pawn, because if he can promote it, he's winning the game. Great moves as a computer, so Alexander had 3 great moves in a row until now. And if it was not for the b2 pawn that you get promoted, you have a queen against a rook and a bishop and knight. The win is far from trivial, because the 3 pieces can collaborate and win the black queen if possible. Maybe 1 or 2 of them will be threatened, but then white would be ahead. But let's see what is going to happen. We completed the first 45 moves, and Alexander is ahead by 5.29. Will this be enough to make him win the game? Rook goes to b3 for Blazo, and pawn to g5, just in case Alexander wants to start pushing his other pawn along the g file in case something happens to the b pawn. Knight to e5. So Blazo wants to bring his knight near the b2 pawn. You see that if the knight will go to c4, then the b2 pawn is attacked twice by the knight and the rook, defended only by the black queen, and black doesn't have any other piece to bring, the other 3 pawns, and the king cannot come anywhere near. How will Alexander react? Queen to f4 check, king to c3, queen to e5 check, king to b4, and queen to d4 check. At this point, Blazo Kalezic resigned, and Alexander Indjic won the game. Alexander, congratulations for this win as well. But let's see what would happen if uh, Blazo would not resign. By the way, you see that Alexander has an advantage of 5.71. It's a significant one. At low levels, less than 2,000, I wouldn't advise anyone to resign. At a very high level, people can even resign for smaller advantages. But just let's see what would happen if White wanted to continue. Knight blocks a check, queen takes a d3. You see, the rook cannot take the queen because then the pawn would promote. But in fact, the rook took the queen, the pawn promotes now. And you have queen versus rook and knight with black also having 3 extra pawns. King to c3, queen to e1 with a check, king to c2, g4, we start pushing the g pawn, continue pushing the g pawn, that would go to g3. So black, they lost their b pawn, but the g pawn is near promotion. Queen protects it in case since rook attacks it. Knight to f3, queen to f2 check, to c1, king to h7. So black little by little will bring the queen. Actually, will bring the king. Now, if the pawn would go to g2, the knight would take it, and queen would take the knight. And we have a case of queen versus rook. And this is a little bit peculiar. Many times the rook can create a fortress and keep the draw. But in this time, black has 2 extra pawns. So I think most likely black would win the game even if he lost a pawn but got the knight instead. King to d1, queen to f3 check, king to d2, and this is how long the computer would go. But the game ended here with Blazo resigning. And let's give a look at the review. What does the computer think about the game overall? Alexander had 2 brilliant moves and 4 great moves. Out of the 49 moves, let's count 627, 4, 627, 11, 38 out of the 49 moves for Alexander were the best moves out of his choices, about 3/4. Blazo had no brilliant or great moves. He had 20 moves to the best versus 21 for Alexander. Excellent 6 for Blazo versus 8 for Alexander. Good 8 for Blazo, 2 for Alexander. 11 book moves each. With great players, many times they can go that far in book moves. Occasionally, a player may on purpose deviate from theory to surprise their opponent. And in the other category, things to be considered to be improved. 3 inaccuracies for Blazo, 1 mistake each of them, no misses or blunders. And this concludes the presentation of this game by Alexander Indjic. Alexander, thank you very much for suggesting these 2 games to show them to our channel. And let's see if I have the list in front of me. Who else remains out of my Facebook friends? Rothstein and Zographos are the 2 names I have in my list, and Siembos also today sent me a message. So 3 players, some of them have sent me 1 game, some players have sent me 2 games. These are the next items in my list. I also have to show the games I played in the Connecticut Chess Championship and in the most recent Chessanity tournament in Long Island. Let's give a look at the tournaments. The grecochess, nothing has changed. Grecochess, still waiting for hunting achievement to see if he's going to challenge Maxim Govorukha or not in the first group. Otherwise, Maxim Govorukha is very near advancing. Second group, Barak 7, after defeating MGC 89, he has guaranteed he's advancing the final round. MGC 89 needs to win the game that he has with White so that both of them can advance. Group 3, myself, Tehari with White and Delay from Hungary were still competing with each other. In Group 4, my skin with Italy has advanced. And let's see the Moonlight Tournament. How is this going? Underwater Moonlight. More games are completed because there are more players. And let's see what's happening. 10.5 for Lotus Time Chess leading in Group 1. 9 for Spider 99 Group 2. The organizer Zanilo, 9 points in Group 3. Rishi Raj 3 with 5 points from Group 4. Imam MMT for Group 5 with 9 points. Munja 44, Group 6 with 10 points. Gendalf 66, 11 points from Group 7. Group 8 will not participate. Khaled Katab from Egypt is leading with 4 points. And Group 9 we have Hikaru Kalsenthal with 10 points. This concludes the presentation of this game by Alexander Indjic. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Thanks to the viewers and subscribers, to the likes and to the encouraging comments. We'll be later with another video with another game of my Facebook friends. And for now, best wishes to all and goodbye.